There's a school of thought in the online right that the powers that be have purposefully stopped hammering the Western peoples with woke messaging. They know that they've overplayed their hand and that people have started to turn against the system, the institutions and so on because they rightly feel like they're being discriminated against. The theory goes that the liberal regime knew that if they kept hammering woke, it would lead to some form of social breakdown, and we can now see that woke does feel a bit like yesterday's news. When someone calls something woke, it feels a bit like a boomer cliche at this point, and we're seeing new iterations of woke develop, perhaps most famously the idea of the woke right from the rational, humanist, classical liberal types. Now, I'm not too sure about this woke right label. It just seems to me to demonize any form of Western identity, and I think identity runs much deeper than ideologies like woke. Identity is inevitable, I think, in the future world. You could also argue that the idea that woke has died is somewhat overblown. Maybe we're just so used to it, we just don't notice anymore as part of the furniture. I mean, we've had the show Adolescence recently, that's been heralded by the media and the powers that be. We've had the celebrations of Eid taking over Easter. We've also had Keir Starmer talking about ninja swords rather than the ninjas using them. We've also had Snow White in Hollywood and the Jaguar fiasco. So woke is clearly still around in the ecosystem, only now it has more competition, most prominently from MAGA 2.0, which is a sort of tech bro libertarianism which hawks back to the 1990s, and it's worse though, it's a sort of Onlyfans Idiocracy where we've seen the return of non-obese, non-trans hot blondes marketing burgers, booze and Hollywood once more. Yet over here in the UK, we seem to be going through something of an identity crisis. Reform was supposed to bring balance to the force, however they've turned out to be more establishment containment, and the leftist liberals seem to be aiming towards a post-woke icon in the form of Gary Stevenson. Now, because Stevenson has come out of nowhere and is featuring on the mainstream media all of a sudden, it's led some to assume he may well have been astroturfed. That means amplified by the powers that be, rather than getting where he is organically. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, but it does seem fair to get beyond political tribalism and try and actually listen to what the guy is saying. And it does seem to me he's making some fair points, some points I've made on this channel. You know, young people are aware of mass inequality. They know they're never going to own a home. Wages are stagnant. They feel like the system doesn't care about them. They're getting poorer. This is why I've made content in the past stating that the young future right-wingers will not be the free marketeers that their grandparents were, simply because the free market doesn't mean to them what it has to their ancestors. To them it means exploitation, it means a lack of opportunity in the world. However, while I'm admittedly not an economic expert, Gary Stevenson's arguments don't seem to be too different from Russell Brand's arguments 10 years ago when he was in his revolutionary socialist phase and reading lots of Thomas Piketty. In essence, both arguments revolve around the notion that to solve the socio-economic problems Britain faces, we need a redistribution of wealth from rich to poor, and we need to see through the illusion that the rich capitalist class blame immigrants for the problems we face, yet in reality it's all of their own doing. So in essence, this seems to be a rinse and repeat argument that occurs every 5 to 10 years in a new guise, and the problems are always the same with it. Number one, if you start taxing the rich at higher levels, they will just leave to somewhere where they don't get taxed, and then you don't get their tax money to spend on social welfare. Number two, there are legitimate concerns to do with immigration, however much you blame the capitalist class. Perhaps another counter-argument that's developed between Brand and Stevenson making these arguments is that we've figured out now that the capitalist class actively promote mass immigration. They want the cheap labour, and on top of that, they don't like unified nations as it limits their power. It would seem to me then that what the liberal regime really fears is populaces that are wary of the liberalisation of markets and wary of social liberal policies too. At the moment, it can pretend we have an effective democracy and hide the tentacles of its own power by promoting voices who critique corporate power and liberal markets while being socially liberal, and then promote voices that argue against wokeism but are pro the markets on the other. This makes Westerners feel like we have a democracy, that we're winning. Of course, the real question to ask here is, why do you never see people promoted who are wary of the globalist market and the DEI dogma of the leftist liberal cultural overlords? That, to me, is the arena where the real King Arthur will stem from. It's why the mainstream has to play it down and obfuscate that position all the time, yet it does bubble away in the soul of the West. So I dare say that far from being a threat, the liberal mainstream is quite happy with folks like Gary Stevenson. With his working class roots and rude boy accent, he's got street cred and he can hoover up the Western disaffected youth. Of course, it's just liberalism through the back door. A lot of these youths will think they're rebelling, but they're actually subtly taking on the liberal social values. And then by the time they have to get a job and enter the corporate world, they'll drop the socialist politics and they'll start to embrace Nigel Farage's reform, which at that point will just be middle of the road liberal Toryism. Of course, this is just my take. Do let me know what you think about it all down below. Consider subscribing to the Substack if you want exclusive content and to connect with me. On top of that, do consider subscribing to the channel if you're new. Have a great rest of the day.